people are going to start questioning the legitimacy. They're going to start, because these schools have started to move away from what they traditionally used to look like. You know, they don't look like what they used to do. They seem to have a different, they've got a different clientele. They seem to have a different purpose. They got a different, everything seems to be, a lot of things seem to be very different. And people are going to pick up on this and they're going to start questioning it. And I think we need to be ready for that. So I wrote that comment. And what I didn't realize, well, there were two things. First of all, a couple of people at the University of Bath picked up on it. Chris James, Professor Chris James, in particular, picked up on it. And he and also, whilst that book was being published, in April 2014, so that book was being written, that's why it's not been written, it's been published, it was in press. In April 2014, I didn't predict this really, but in 2014, in April 2014, there was a big incident in Jakarta. And the authorities in Indonesia, but mainly Jakarta, where most of the international schools are or were, they started directly questioning the legitimacy of the schools there. They'd noticed that the number of international schools had grown in Jakarta enormously, but the number of expat people hadn't really grown much. So they started working out that the clientele had changed. And they suddenly realized that these schools were taking a lot more Indonesian children, and that was becoming a bit of a concern to them because they didn't realize that. They then realized that these schools weren't accredited. Only about 20% of them were accredited. So they started worrying about the standard of the schools and who's inspecting these schools, what standard are they up to Indonesian standards. They started realizing that they weren't doing an international curriculum. So then they started questioning, are there really 50 international schools in Jakarta? We don't believe it. Yeah, so they actually started to question the legitimacy, which I had sort of semi-predicted at the same time in the book. It was just coming out. It came out in July 2014. It got to the point in Jakarta where the authorities actually said that the schools couldn't call themselves international schools. So even Jakarta International School, which was very similar to the Copenhagen International School that I'd worked at, even that school got questioned in terms of it had been founded by the Australian Embassy in 1956 or something like that. It was, on paper, it was a traditional international school, but even that school was under attack in terms of its legitimacy and had to prove that it was an international school. It had to change its name. I believe it changed its name to Jakarta Intercultural School, so it kept the JIS brand. But so there was an interesting incident there where the identity and the purpose and the character of schools that had previously not been questioned, it suddenly raised a lot of questions about what are they, and are they international schools? And if they're not international schools, then what? Their legitimacy was questioned. So I mentioned Chris James. So at that time, Professor Chris James and myself and Michael Fertig here at the University of Bath, we set about trying to theorize this, bringing in, and Professor Chris James, his background was in institutionalization theory, and he gave a framework which I didn't know about, which just happened to really support. It gave a framework for us to actually theorize what was going on. So we used this institutionalization theory to develop a couple of papers. So that was sort of what happened in 2014. James, I'll just sort of leave it there if you want to just. No, we'll come back.
Well, no, actually, that's because 2014 was a watershed. Not only, with your book, but in many ways, the book identified a couple of threads I'd like to look at today. One of the major threads, of course, the book picked up on and you extrapolated in other papers and research was this idea that the clientele was changing. I think it was the first year where it became really clear that the old 20% local and 80% overseas had completely done a flip in the previous decade, and it was now
completely reversed. Yeah.
Do you want to talk? Can you talk a little bit maybe about what you found out in terms of that flipping of the clientele and maybe some of the challenges that posed? I would like to come back and talk about the teachers as well, because I know you've done a lot of work on that. But maybe just talk about that flip that had happened and the ramifications for that.
Yeah. Well, the shift in demographics is the biggest. That is the biggest. Well, it's the most noticeable shift. I'm not convinced that it is a complete shift, actually, because I'm actually just about to on the verge of finishing off another book which I've written with a colleague called Adam Poole, who has written quite a lot recently about international schools and in China, and meaning the reality, the lived reality of being a teacher, an international school teacher, an IST in China, in the sort of post-ideal era, and some of the data that I've collected quite recently shows that it looks as if if you take China as a whole, it's about 50 or 60% of the children are local. So I'm not sure. I mean, there might be schools where it's 80-20, but in some ways that might be a slight exaggeration. But there has been a complete. I mean, I even saw it in Copenhagen when I first went there. There weren't many Danish children, and the number of Danish children increased every single year to the point where when I left in 2014, probably about 20-30% of the children at the school were Danish, and previously we just hadn't catered for Danish children at all. So something, even in Denmark, even in Copenhagen, something had happened there, where we noticed that there was a sort of parent. We identified them as being sort of quite cosmopolitan. There were the Danes that had been abroad, that worked for Maersk or World Health Organization, who have a big base in Copenhagen, and they'd come back to Denmark, and their kids had maybe been to other schools, or they seemed a bit more international than maybe they weren't. I'm not sure that they were local Danes as such. They were sort of there seemed to be a different class. There was English. There was they wanted a more sort of international pathway for their children, because they themselves seemed a bit more international. And since then, people have started talking about this notion of a global middle class, a GMC, saying that in different countries there's a growing, aspiring, wealthy middle class in places like China, etc. But there's also there is a class within that that's more sort of globally oriented. Maybe they've been more of a global experience. Maybe they're internationally minded, and they want their children to have something that's more international. They want more pathways for the child. They want the child to be able to work abroad, like maybe they've worked abroad. So there does seem to be a new class emerging. It's very contextualized, because it does look very different in different countries. Well, it would, because even the middle class looks different in different countries. The American middle class probably doesn't look like the English middle class, and it wouldn't look like the Egyptian middle class. So the global middle class wouldn't necessarily be a class. It's not going to be a worldwide class. It's going to be a class in different countries that's got sort of common tastes, common sense of distinction, common aspirations, maybe a common background, common values. So that's what makes it a class as such. But it's very much sort of a class in formation. But there does seem to be a new type of parent that's sort of attracted to international schooling that wasn't previously. It's not just a wealthy, a sort of richer class. It seems to be something a little bit different. But we're at a very early stage in terms of working out who they are and what they are, and whether their children constitute a global middle class. There is a view, in fact, even from Paul Tark out in Canada, that even the teachers now in international schools constitute a global middle class as well. So it's a type of, and so that's interesting. Maybe a sort of a global middle class teaching a global middle class whose parents are a global middle class. So it's all a very interesting sort of scenario, but it's very different from what was going on in 1990 when it was that class wasn't involved really in international schooling. It was very much sort of the transnational elite. And they're still involved, they're still there, of course, but there just seems to be another class, a class that's sort of a little bit lower and more unusual, if you like, that's got involved. So the demographic side of it is probably the biggest change. And I said the parents that have got involved and are buying into international schooling do seem quite different from the parents that had been previously involved. And of course that means that now that their children are now deliberately being put into international schooling. They're not, when I first taught in international schools in 1990, we had the view that the children were there because their parents, they just happened to be there. It was just, they didn't want to be there. A lot of these kids just really didn't want to be. They'd moved there. Some of them have been in 10 or 11 schools around the world. There were a lot of issues. There were third culture kids. That term was predominant at the time. There was a lot of, they were there because their parents just happened to be working in London. That isn't the case now. If the local parents are choosing international schools, it's particularly interesting in somewhere like Qatar, where you've got a voucher system. So the Qatari parents can choose any school. They can choose any private school in Qatar. And you've got a very rich diversity of schools in Qatar. You've got models based on the English private system. Sherborne School has a branch there. You've got the French schools there. You've got very elite Qatari private schools there, boys' schools. You've got traditional international schools. You've got some doing the IB. So why would you choose a particular school? Why would you choose an international school if you've got that sort of choice? That's where we need to start doing some research into the Qatari parents, because they've got choice. That's proper choice. They might have to top it up a little bit in terms of if they want to send their children to a more expensive school. But clearly there's a Qatari middle class that's buying into the International School of London has a branch in Qatar, in Doha, and about 50% of the parents are Qatari parents. But they have a choice. So why they're choosing ISLQ and not choosing other schools? It's an interesting situation. But the other big change that's been understated is the governance situation. The movement towards for-profit is not talked about much, but it is a very big shift for an area of education that's traditionally been non-profit making and seeing itself as having very high ethical and moral values. The shift towards for-profit is very big, and it's very unsettling for a lot of people. There are traditional schools that have been around a long time, and they're traditional international schools that were non-profit making, and they're being bought by for-profit companies. And if the people working in those that's a big shift. It's a big change, and there's a lot of contradictions that start to appear there in terms of the mission and the purpose of the school, and what the and that's creating quite a few tensions. I think within the arena or the field, sort of generally, and that leads us back to the legitimacy issue, with people questioning the legitimacy, particularly of for-profit international schools, which changes the nature and purpose of the school in quite problematic ways, in terms of the ethics and the moral values of the schools. Anyway, we can come back to that in a minute, James. But
yeah, no, I mean, this is fascinating, because you're absolutely right. The field is so dynamic and fluid right now. I don't think there's a clarity around it. I'd like to dig into this idea about, and maybe push back a little bit, this idea that the schools were mission driven. I'm going to make a statement, and I'm curious your reaction to it would be. I think international schools, before we moved into the modern era, you had essentially two major thrusts within international schools. And the predominant thrust, traditionally called Type A, was born in the bowels of imperialism, however you want to call that, colonialism. And it was to serve an expat elite who, for the most part, didn't want to buy in or didn't believe the local education system was going to allow them to continue to promote and hold their power base. I think, and they were the dominant power. That was really unquestioned. So that's group. And then group two, as you know as well, and we've talked about this before, group two really came out of, a much smaller group came out of World War II, World War I, World War II, and it was much more this idea of what we would now call global mindedness, international perspectives. It was much more global. It's interesting to me, I'm getting to my point, it's interesting to me to see how the recent changes and that lack of understanding of what those schools were are coming together, challenging legitimacy, but on a, how would I say this, on a decolonization, limited hiring of people of color, and how that is playing itself out. And it's like, this information is new, but actually this information's been around for at least, I'm thinking The Emperor's New Clothes, I forget who wrote that, but it's been around since the early 90s. And yet now it seems to be hitting the table when we've been writing about it for decades already. We've known about this. There have been people calling for improvement of contracts for teachers. So maybe we could talk a little bit about, I know one of the leading areas you look at is this idea of the precarious nature of teachers, international, and how it has actually changed and continues to change. Could you speak a little bit to that, Tristan?
Yeah. Okay. So what we're hitting on here is what in the last book I wrote for Emerald publishers, and I talked about international education, the new era. And one of the things that I talked about there was what I call a truth prism. And it's this notion that international schools have always been, they've always been ethical and moral, and had this amazing sort of idealistic mission. Private schooling generally is very good at protecting itself. It has this truth prism. If I give you an example, it makes it a little bit easier to describe. But if you take the private elite schools in England, that are very elite, very elitist. I'm talking now about the Clarendon Commission schools. The top 9 schools in England that make up most of the judiciary and the MPs and the civil service, etc. When they're attacked for being elite, they turn around and say they're a charity. So that's their truth prism. They're able to turn around and say, well, we're a charity. We've got charitable status. We have enormous number of scholarships. You don't understand it. You don't understand what we do. This is just there's a way of deflecting criticism and being able to survive. It's a survival instinct, because every now and then the private schools in England come under attack, and they're always able to sort of wriggle out of it, so they don't have to pay VAT, and they keep this charitable status, and they keep their image of being a charity. And if you flip that to international schools, what do? Well, they're very good at saying, look at our mission. We're international. We've got lots of scholarships. We're inclusive. Inclusive has become one way of deflecting criticism. Saying we're an inclusion school. We're inclusive. We take any nationality. We don't. We're non-selective. We don't have tests. We don't have testing. Whereas we know that elite schools generally have ways of filtering children to enter the school, but on paper they seem inclusive, and of course it's easy. The international schools they've been allowed to create their own narrative, and I think this is true of elite schools generally. Private schools in England have been allowed to create their own narrative. They're very good at telling their story. And if you look at if you want to get the history of private schools, you normally have to get it from somebody who's worked at one of them and who's been to one of them, because it tends to be insiders that tend to write the history. And I think that is true of international schooling. It's been allowed to write its own history, right, and its own narrative, and it's been allowed to use the sort of, I called it in my previous book, in my Emerald book, I called it the Geneva Distortion, and I said that there's this notion that international schooling was born out of Geneva, and the International School of Geneva is the mothership. And that's and every other school was modelled upon the International School of Geneva. Now that is true in one regard, because an institution needs a model, because that's what makes it an institution. Yeah. So international schools that emerged in the 50s and the 60s, including Copenhagen International School, and in the 70s, like International School of London, they did all start to look like International School of Geneva. Because so there was that institutionalization process, but then you've got the mission. So you say, well, we've got this mission. Again, it's this sort of truth prism. The schools who creates the mission of the school? The school creates the mission. So the school creates its own narrative, and it is true of elite schools generally, James. They're very good at protecting themselves by creating their own history, and they've got something they can fall back on if they need to defend themselves. And of course, that's what happened that's probably what happened in Jakarta. When the traditional international schools came. Well, it was what happened, because I saw some letters in the Jakarta Post from the traditional international schools saying, "Hang on, have you not looked at our mission? We're not for profit. We're not all like that." So there was a backlash from some of the traditional international schools who suddenly started talking about their mission and their history, so there was a little bit of they did bring in that was when they started to create they were suddenly having to sort of start externally talking about this narrative, which we use internally normally, because we don't normally have to use that external. But there is that sort of truth prism, and what you were getting at there, James, I think, is that truth prism, isn't it? There's all these myths about international schooling, which you can understand why investors who have been looking at a model, international schooling was a convenient model for many investors. You know, if you're going to make it, if you're going to create, if you want to create a school that's going to make a profit, an international school is a good way of doing it because they're easy to defend. So they're quite useful. It's quite a useful model to sort of reverse into, if you see what I mean. And I think a lot of investors and a lot of edupreneurs have taken, in some ways, I'm sort of saying they've hijacked the project in a way, because I think it is true that they've taken international schooling as a convenient model that they can move into it, make a profit. Yeah, it's very sustainable, and it's easy to defend because you then hark back to the myths and the Geneva Distortion and the. So it's a complex situation, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I'm even thinking, well, I don't know if I can say this, but I'm thinking like some of the accreditation bodies, in many ways, they're trying to use a national. In my opinion, they're often trying to apply a national set of values to a smaller group, an increasingly smaller group of international schools, and saying, well, the values that work in country X should also be the values that work internationally. And of course, there's rife problems with when you take that approach. How would you agree with that? I mean, how would you assess that?
Well, this gets us on to thinking about the sort of the contract issue,
right? And that's what we get into soon.
Yeah, because this is something that I've always been very interested in. Is this issue about, well, if these schools have values that are inclusive, and they're egalitarian, and they're very democratic, and they're internationally minded, and then why is it that we have contracts in the schools that undermine all of that? I can give you a very concrete example. Copenhagen International School. I went there on an I was employed from outside Copenhagen. So I joined the school as an overseas hire teacher, which gave me a much higher status than most of the other teachers in the school. I had a contract. I got a stipend, quite a nice stipend every month for 3 years. And I had a nice package, lots of perks. You know, I had the trappings of the international hire, international school teacher. But it was only for 3 years. And after 3 years, it was renewable for another 2 years at the discretion of the director. Now, that is a very interesting situation, isn't it? So you're in a school where the school, if it wants, can get rid of you. If you've done something, if the director doesn't like you, or you fall out with the director, or a new director joins the school and they decide that they want to bring in other people, you can lose your contract. You can lose that status as an overseas hire teacher. So I suddenly felt, when I suddenly realized just how precarious the situation is. Even working somewhere like Copenhagen, it's a very precarious situation. You don't, so it's at the discretion of the director. And then it's renewable for another 2 years. And then after 5 years, that's it. You're then local hire. So every teacher then becomes local hire. And that involves a 20% drop in salary, which I took on the chin because I enjoyed working at the school and I enjoyed working in Copenhagen. I was writing. There were other reasons, you know, it wasn't just the salary, but that was in a country like Denmark, when you have a 20% cut in salary, you can't really survive financially. So that's the school's way of saying it's time to go. Yeah, it's a sort of very discreet way of an international school saying, you've been here 5 years, it's time to go. And we're pushing you out the door. No matter how good you are or how well liked you are, It's time to move on. So yeah, so then you've got this drop in status, and I started thinking about the status anyway, because when I was in Copenhagen, there was an international community there. There were expats there, but I wasn't an expat. And I remember I went to a meeting of expats, and they said, "Oh, what company do you work for?" I said, "I work for a school." They said, "Oh, well, that's not a company. You're not an expat. You're a teacher working in Copenhagen." I wasn't even allowed to join this expat community because I wasn't working for the BBC or the British Embassy or the American Embassy or the World Health. You know, I wasn't doing that sort of. I wasn't the expatriate. I wasn't an expatriate as such. But I wasn't a Dane either, and I couldn't. You can't really get involved in Danish society unless you're Danish. So you're always an outsider. So then I suddenly realized that you're sort of somewhere in the middle. You know, there's a sort of middling actor, and I wrote a paper on this called The Meddling Actor. And then other people sort of picked up on it and in other contexts and said, yeah, that you're in the middle of somewhere. It's a very precarious situation. And that I was sort of very interested in this whole sort of precarity issue in terms of your status. And this book that I've just been writing with Adam Poole, we've highlighted two areas of precarity from the data that Adam had collected from expats teaching in China. And they were very much what I'd noticed in Copenhagen. There was a status precarity, and there was a friendship precarity. And maybe I'll just say a little bit about it, because the status precarity is fairly straightforward, but the friendship precarity is this notion that when you're in a school where people are moving around a lot, you don't really make friends. You know, you meet people that are friendly, but they're not friends. That was a quote from one of the people that Adam had been interviewing, saying, you know, I've got people. There are people at this school who are friendly, but we're not friends. We're never going to meet in 5-10 years' time. We're just passing through, and so then we started thinking about, well, how do people cope with that? And what you do is you join a clique. You join a clique, so you become and there's different types of cliques that you might join, and they're just a very useful coping strategy for just dealing with that precarity. But going back to the contract situation, one of the reasons that I had initially in Copenhagen a very lucrative high status contract is that I was British. Now, I was joining the school with a lot of cultural capital, and I was just quite lucky in that way, because this is the story that's not told about international schools, in that if you're coming from native English speaking countries, you are bringing a lot of cultural capital with you, which is quite useful on the circuit, and it will get you a better contract. And this issue about contracts and discrimination in favor of people, which obviously is not, maybe it's not so much discrimination against people, but it's discrimination in favor of people. And I wrote a paper about that quite recently in the Journal of Research and International Education, about this discrimination in favor of British and North American teachers. And it's deeply structural, in the sense that it's been there for a long time and it's not going to go away. You see it in the way that people are recruited. You look at where the recruitment, look at where the job fairs are. They're in places where there's a lot of British and North American teachers. It's easier for them to get there. It's cheaper for them to get there. You can go to a hotel in Marble Arch. Well, it's not going to be easy to fly in from Ghana or somewhere across. So even it's all very structural. You know, there's structures in place that benefit certain types of teacher. And they have been allowed, well, for a long time now, to benefit from this. And as a result, they dominate the market. So even in this new era, this post-ideal era, where everything's changed, well, everything hasn't changed, because the one thing that stayed constant, and this is something that I mentioned in both my last book and the new book I'm writing, the one thing that has stayed constant, the one assumption that you can make that is still true, is that international schools are still dominated generally across the board as a field. They're still dominated by Western-centric, Anglo-Saxon teachers, Anglo-Saxon educators. And it's even more so, I think, at a leadership level. And that hasn't really ever been addressed in terms of the sort of, there was a paper quite recently written by Alexander Taggart, who's at Manchester, University of Manchester. He wrote a paper quite recently about the whiteness of leaders in international schools. So the topic is starting to attract attention. But there is that sort of hidden side of international schooling that's never really been addressed. And and of course, it's also made it's become even more structural, with the traditional international schools wanting to be internationally minded and seem to be internationally minded, because that lends itself again to having teachers from Britain and North America, the notion that they are more internationally minded. So you don't have to train them, because they're automatically, they have that mindset. So that has benefited. So, you know, all the developments that have occurred have benefited the teachers from Anglo-Saxon countries. The demographic change, I think in a lot of countries, the parents want a certain type of teacher. They want a certain type of leader. And again, it just happens to benefit the white Anglo-Saxon male teacher. And that's made it even, so in fact, all the changes that occurred have actually benefited a certain type of educator and made it so that the structural issues that were there actually become even more structural. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, we've spoken at length about this. I think it was Snowball, right, in the late early 200s, wrote about the fact that 60% of the teachers in international schools come from 4 countries. And yet on the outside of the school, you have global or international, yet you're really drawing on 4, US, Australia, Canada, and the UK. So you're really getting a certain person from those countries or their surrounding regions. And I mean, we've joked about this. Why not put a moratorium in those 4 countries and hire people from elsewhere? But you and I, we've joked about that. But I think there's a level of truth. Tristan, I'm aware of the time here, and I'm aware that you've got.
No, it's fine. I'm quite happy to keep going on this, because it's quite an important topic, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you're right about the issue of the teachers coming from certain countries, and you know, it's an interesting issue there. That if you take, I mean, the number of teachers leaving England every year, it's about 18,000 teachers leaving England each year to go to international schooling. So it's almost sort of half of all the teachers that are entering the arena are coming from one country, and I don't know how sustainable that is. And you know, it's been written before about, you know, where are all the teachers going to come from? But they just keep coming. They just keep coming from England and from North America. There doesn't seem to be any sort of there doesn't seem to be any shortage there. But at some point, people are going to start picking up on this from a shortage of teachers in England perspective, the sort of brain drain. And people are starting to talk about it. There has been a few articles in the British press about this brain drain. And where are these teachers going? And they're starting to realize they are going to international schools. They are going abroad. They're not coming back like they used to. Because previously, teachers went to international schools, they might do 3 or 4 years and go back to Britain or back to America, back to Ireland. And that was a positive thing. That became a brain gain. But I don't think we've got that brain gain. That isn't happening anymore because teachers are going into international schooling and they're getting locked in. They're becoming institutionalized. They have a high status. They're moving from school to school. So there's a very high mobility. There's a high turnover, but there's quite a low attrition rate. We don't see many teachers leaving. We don't see, there's a lot of talk in the British press about teachers escaping Britain, fleeing Britain. This is the words they use, quite condescending, but because we don't know the reasons why they're doing it. But we don't hear about people fleeing back to Britain, do you? Or even though the field is highly precarious and getting more precarious, which is interesting, isn't it? So there's an interesting growth paradox there, and that's really the bedrock of this book that I've just written, which will be coming out hopefully during the summer for Emeralds, where we actually start the book with this growth paradox, that there's a field of education, international schooling, which is growing enormously. It's attracting more and more teachers from the same countries that it's always attracted them from. Yet at the same time, so it's becoming increasingly attractive, but it's also becoming increasingly precarious. So clearly there's a need to theorize that. I think, well, what is it what happens when these teachers enter international schooling? Why is it that they're staying within the field? Okay, they're moving from school to school, but why are they staying there and how are they coping? So from a sociological perspective, that's become quite interesting, hasn't it? That because the growth wouldn't continue if the teachers left the field. If they all suddenly left China, then there probably wouldn't be enough teachers. The schools wouldn't be able to survive. So that growth paradox has become a very interesting area of potential research.
Yeah, maybe we should use that then just to bring it back full circle to where we began the conversation. Is so we've talked about issues of legitimacy and how that looks and how it plays itself out. Based on what you've done, your research, your thinking, your experiences, looking into a crystal ball. Short term, what does a legitimate international school look like? And then further afield, what's your prognosis for them in the future? And we'll wrap it up with those two questions.
Yeah, okay. So I've been giving this a lot of thought about going back to this institutionalization theory. So myself and Chris James and Mike Furtick, we set about trying to theorize. Well, what is an international school? What should it look like? What does it look like? And we started thinking about an institution. What is an institution? And the notion that an institution has certain norms, processes, procedures, activities, artifacts. There's a normative model, and there are certain things you'd expect an international school to look like and to do. And from that, I've become very clear in my writing that what's called in literature the 5 Fs. The food, the festival, the flags, the things that begin with F. There's actually more than 5, because if you actually sit down and draw up a list, there's about 15 of them. But so I call them the numerous Fs. So there are these numerous Fs, and they're very, very important because they are carriers of institutionalization. Yeah. So the food festival that international schools do is really important, and that is. If you didn't do it, your claim to being an international school would be seriously reduced. And the flags and the artifacts, the things that are on the walls, the activities, the rituals that the school does, are all very important because they're part of what's called the normative pillar of an institution. So they're the things that you would expect an institution to normally do, because that's what that type of institution normally does. So it's very important for the leader of an international school to make sure that those that normative pillar is a strong pillar. There's a regulative pillar, and that's obviously things that you have to do. And some of that is a little bit out of the leader's control, but at the same time, accreditation strengthens that. Doing an international curriculum strengthens that. The IB has a very strong set of regulations, and that really strengthens that regulative pillar. So if a school is to be accredited, if it becomes a member of a regional association, it becomes even just a member of a local association in Japan. I'm not sure what the regional association would be, James. You might know, what would it be there?
Yeah, JSCD, I suppose, the Japan International Schools Association. Yeah, I think.
Right, but that type of organisation will have certain membership criteria, which help to strengthen the regulative pillar. In other words, they're saying that if you want to join this network, you have to have certain features. So that's part of the regulative pillar. And then the other thing that leaders can also do in order to help with the legitimacy issue is think about what's called the cultural cognitive pillar. So there's 3 pillars of institutionalization. The cultural cognitive pillar is the other pillar, which is basically you look at what other schools are doing and you adapt. And international schools are quite good at doing this because they have such a high turnover of leaders and people. So when people go to one international school to another, they carry with them, which is why they're called carriers, the carriers of institutionalization. They carry with them certain activities, certain procedures. They bring with them things that went on in the other school. So when people join your school and they say, "Oh, at our previous school we did this," that is the institutionalization process that's happening. It's very important to let that happen. And I know it's quite annoying actually, because when you sit there I'm sure as a leader of a school, you probably sit there and think, "Don't come to my school and tell me how to do things," or "Why is it everything seems to be better at your other school?" Or if it's misinterpreted, it can seem like you come here and think we're not doing a good job. But it's actually really important because that is part of the isomorphic process. So you have to let that happen. Yeah, so people come from school to school and they bring with them normally good practice. So they bring with them things that went on in the other school that worked well, and they want to bring it to your school. And I think as a school leader, you have to let that happen, because it's very important because what happens then is that your school starts to look like the other schools, and then when the parents come to your school, they say, "Oh yeah, you look like the school we were at in Jakarta or in London or somewhere." So it's important for the identity of the school and the legitimacy of the school to look like the other schools that claim to be your type of school. And that process of people coming to your school and joining the school and carrying with them activities, artifacts, changes, and it's quite a positive thing. And the moment we're seeing that, I think, in a lot of international schools where teachers are bringing with them maybe ideas for decolonizing the curriculum, for instance. So that's going on in some schools, and then those people are going to leave those schools and go to your school, and they're going to bring with them the ideas and the practice. So that will then enable other schools to be able to do that. And then over time, what happens there over time is that there's that helps the legitimacy issue, because schools that claim to be an international school will look like the other international schools in other countries and in other areas. So that institutionalization process is an important one. I think for a leader of a school, it's important to remember that you're not just the leader of a school, you're leader of an institution. And an institution has certain norms and processes and procedures. And some of that will be regulated, some of it you have to do, but some of it is it's what other schools do. And it's also, so you have to be open to that sort of change, if you like.
Yeah, maybe, and just then I guess Tristan, just I mean, those are obviously well considered, well researched opinions and ideas, more than opinions. That's what the research is telling us. Are international schools, type 2, type A, are they going to survive?
Well, yeah, people have asked this question. People have asked this question before, and the answer was always yes. It is clearly international schools are particularly the traditional international schools, and we don't know too much about this what one might be called the non-traditional. Adam, if I just say a little bit about that, because Adam Poole out in China, he's at Beijing, in university at Beijing, but he was teaching in an IB school. There's a group of schools there which he calls Chinese internationalized schools, and they're what you might call non-traditional international schools. Now, to answer your question, I don't know if they will survive. So they are schools that are catering, well, they're mainly staffed by, the majority of teachers are Chinese. They're offering a fusion of curricula. So they may be doing IB, but most of them are not doing IB, they're doing a fusion, which is experimental. And it isn't clear if that's a good pathway for their children to enter university. They're delivering a type of education that Ewan Wright, who's out in China as well, he's now starting to call it Cosmopolitan Nationalism. So in other words, it's a form of cosmopolitanism or international mindedness that is coming under attack and is having to be more and more nationalistic and more patriotic. So to answer your question, I don't know if that type of school is going to survive. I don't know if it's going to flourish and survive. Clearly, it is very, very precarious, and it's on the at the moment it seems to be allowed to continue, as it were. But whether it will continue to grow and in the way that it is, I don't know. But to go back to the traditional type of international school, and we do have to make a big distinction between the schools. The traditional type, it came under attack in Jakarta, but it was able to survive. It was able to the truth prisms kicked in, all that narrative that's been built up sort of kicked in, as it were. It was able to prove itself through accreditation, it was able to survive and grow. So that the traditional type, to answer your question, I think the traditional type will continue to develop, and it's that cultural cognitive pillar that's constantly changing and bringing in new ideas and fresh ideas. And international schools are quite flexible because of the autonomy of traditional international schools. They do have the freedom to be able to change quite quickly. And this is why I think the Chinese internationalized schools that have a very, very, very strong regulative pillar and a very weak cultural cognitive pillar, I'm not sure if they will survive, because that their room for maneuver, as it were, is quite limited. They don't have the autonomy that traditional international schools have.
Thank you, Tristan. I know on the day you won't be able to join us due to COVID restrictions, and I think we've talked about this at the outset. You are more than comfortable, though. People are going to watch this video. If they post on the blog, 48 hours, you'll be able to get back to them and chat with them in each case, if not in real time. Yeah. I really look forward to any questions and queries, or I absolutely look forward to engaging at a sort of question and answer level. And I hope this session's been useful. It's a fascinating period in time, actually, in lots of different ways. Right. We've got the COVID issues going on, and that's complicated things quite a lot. And there's some interesting. We were quite at an early stage in terms of researching into what the effects of COVID are going to be, but
Lucy Bailey, who's written quite a lot about teachers in international schools, and she's just published a paper. She was very quick off the mark. She's published a paper about the effects of COVID, and it's showing that a lot of teachers in international schools are they're starting to feel that they don't have the freedom that they used to have. So there's a sort of undermining of agency. Previously the whole world was your oyster. You could go anywhere you want, and that clearly isn't the case at the moment, where a lot of teachers are starting to look at countries and think, do I really want to work there? Can I work there? Will I be allowed to go and work there? And conversely, interestingly, countries that previously weren't very attractive to international school teachers have actually started to become more attractive because they're maybe COVID secure. So countries like Vietnam, for instance, which hasn't had a COVID problem, maybe it's used to dealing with SARS and these types of outbreaks. All of a sudden, countries like Vietnam have started to become more attractive. And I think it's good we're going to see more teachers wanting to work in that type of country where they don't seem to have the issues of COVID, like they have in other countries. So, there are implications there for where people want to work, and where there might be countries in a few years' time where there's a shortage of teachers. And there may be countries where there's a glut of teachers and there's actually too many teachers and there's a lot of competition. And that will create tensions as well. Because previously we haven't had that problem, have we? Teachers sort of nicely spread themselves out across the world. And there doesn't seem to have been a glut or a shortage or too many teachers. But that Lucy Bailey's research is starting to show that perhaps there are some issues there. So it's interesting times in terms of precarity. Now that's another precarity. It's sort of it's not a status precarity or a friendship precarity, which myself and Adam have picked up on. It's maybe another type of precarity there, more localized, more about, if I go and work there, will I be able to leave the country? Will I be able to work online in that country? And there are all these questions that people are now starting to think about in terms of the logistics of actually just doing the job, which COVID has given lots of, it's sort of changed the way we approach things, doesn't it? Think about things. But also it's fascinating in terms of the growth of international schooling, particularly in places like China, new models emerging, new types of parent emerging. I said the global middle class. We're at very early stages in terms of researching into that. And what I would say is it's a very interesting time to be doing research and into international schooling, because it's attracted the attention of sociologists at last, who, the people that hadn't really picked up on this elite model of education, and they're sort of starting to realize that there's an interesting area of education that needs to be theorized. And journals are starting to accept papers much more readily than they used to. And there's scope for a lot more research at a sociological level. In this book that I'm writing with Adam, we've introduced a sociological imagination. And there's a lot of scope for sort of imagining what's going on and looking at things from the perspective of other people, and it's quite an interesting. It's a very interesting area. We're at quite an interesting sort of crossroads in many ways.
And just again, for people who are listening, book comes out when? Who will it be published by? Where will we be able to?
Oh, the book is the book I'm talking about. It will be published by Emerald. Emerald, it's an Emerald publishing company, and it's called Insecurity and Precarity in International Schooling, New Realities and New Visions.
Lovely title. Yeah. And that'll be available fairly broad spectrum. Yeah, okay, great. Anyway, Tristan, thank you so much for taking time. I know you're a busy man. And stay well, stay safe, and hopefully...
good luck with the conference, and
Thank
I
you,
look
sir.
forward to engaging in some question and answers later on. I think it's the 11th of April,
Yes,
was it?
it is. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, sir. Stay well.
Okay, thank you very much.